Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big one. What could happen in the Middle East if sanctions on Iran are eased or lifted?
Yeah, it's a huge question. We've got these reports you shared looking at it from, well, all sorts of angles, the economic impacts, the regional power balance, you name it.
So the mission for this deep dive is to try and map out those potential shifts. What are the key changes we might actually see? And, what does it all mean?
Exactly. We're talking about potentially unfreezing this incredibly complex web of sanctions. U.S., EU, UN, it's multi-layered.
Right.
And we want to understand the ripples. What are the likely aftershocks, economically, geopolitically? It's complicated, lots of what-ifs, but we'll try to clarify the main points for you.
Okay, sounds good. So before we dive into those what-ifs, maybe just a quick recap of where things stand right now. It's not just one simple set of sanctions, is it?
No, not at all. Think of it like several overlapping circles.
Yeah.
You've got U.S. sanctions, EU ones, UN measures,
Yeah.
each with different triggers.
Like the nuclear program, regional stuff, human rights.
Precisely. The U.S. ones are really broad-hitting: oil, finance, the IRGC specifically. The EU mirrors some of that, non-proliferation, human rights. And then there's the UN Security Council Resolution 2231.
That's the one tied to the old nuclear deal, right? With the snapback.
Exactly. That allows sanctions to be reimposed quickly, and parts of it expire soon, which adds pressure. The key thing is lifting these isn't like flipping a single switch. It would have to be a carefully sequenced process because they all overlap.
And it sounds like things are still moving, even now, new sanctions coming online.
That's right. Even recently, 2024, 2025, the U.S. has targeted things like oil trade, the smaller refineries, missile support, the EU, too, linked to Ukraine support and human rights. But at the same time, there are these indirect talks happening, sort of behind the scenes.
What's the main sticking point there?
Well, it boils down to trust, really. The U.S. wants concrete, verifiable steps from Iran, especially on the nuclear side. Iran, on the other hand, wants guarantees that relief will stick, that it won't just be reversed later. They want it to be, well, irreversible.
So, given that kind of deadlock, what are the reports saying is the most likely path forward for any kind of relief? Is it all or nothing, or something else?
The consensus seems to lean towards a step-by-step thing. Not a grand bargain all at once, probably. More like partial relief, maybe unlocking some funds or allowing some oil sales in exchange for specific Iranian actions.
Incremental steps.
Exactly. Maybe some kind of interim deal, especially to avoid that UN snapback deadline coming up. It's about finding a workable path, even if it's not the final destination for either side.
Okay, so let's play this out. Imagine some sanctions do get lifted. What's the first big shockwave for Iran's economy?
Oil and gas. That's the immediate one. They've got capacity they're not using right now. So relief could mean a pretty quick jump in production and exports.
How much are we talking?
Well, estimates vary, but maybe an extra 500,000, maybe even close to 1 million barrels per day within the first year or so could get them back towards, say, 3.8 million barrels per day eventually. That's a lot of oil hitting the market.
And a lot of money coming in.
A significant amount, yes. And it's not just about volume. Getting back into the global financial system is crucial, too.
Ah, the SWIFT system.
Exactly. Reconnecting to SWIFT makes international trade way easier, cheaper. Plus, it helps them get access to billions in assets that are currently frozen in banks overseas.
So we'd likely see the Iranian currency, the rial, get stronger.
You'd expect it to appreciate, yes, though, long-term stability depends on how they manage the whole economy, not just the currency.
Right. And to really capitalize on this, especially in energy, they need upgrades, don't they? Their infrastructure must need serious work after years of sanctions.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking huge sums needed. Iran's own oil company estimates something like $135 billion for modernization.
Wow. So where does that money come from? Sanctions relief helps, but...
That doesn't guarantee investment. That's the catch. To attract that kind of foreign capital, Iran needs more than just sanctions relief. They need, well, a stable geopolitical environment, a better climate for investment, less red tape.
More predictability for businesses.
Exactly. And there's a risk, too, this Dutch disease idea. If oil money floods in and dominates everything, it can actually hurt other parts of the economy. So they need careful fiscal management to avoid that.
Makes sense. So looking beyond oil and gas, what other sectors might see growth if things open up?
There's potential across the board, really. Mining, aviation. Think about all the planes they need, parts. Tourism has potential. Manufacturing too. Cars, textiles, petrochemicals.
So a broader economic boost.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Some reports estimate overall trade could jump by, maybe up to $60 billion a year eventually. That could give a serious boost to their GDP, maybe 4% growth or more, according to the IMF, and help create jobs, especially for young people.
Which could help with inflation too.
It should moderate inflation, yes, if managed well. More goods, a stronger currency that usually helps bring prices down.
But, okay, even with sanctions relief, it sounds like there are still hurdles inside Iran. It's not an automatic path to prosperity.
Definitely not. These are deep-seated issues. Bureaucracy, corruption concerns, the big economic footprint of powerful groups like the Revolutionary Guard. These things historically make foreign investors nervous.
And you mentioned this sanctions mafia, people profiting from the current system.
Yeah, there are analyses suggesting certain networks actually benefit from the restrictions. Controlling smuggling routes, exploiting exchange rate differences, and might resist changes that threaten their position. We're talking potentially billions of dollars a year in that shadow economy.
Plus the brain drain issue you mentioned.
Right. Years of isolation have led many skilled Iranians to leave. Reversing that, reintegrating into global supply chains. It requires significant internal policy changes, not just the removal of external sanctions.
Okay, so Iran's economy potentially gets a boost, maybe a big one. How does that ripple outwards into the region? Let's start with energy markets again.
Well, as we said, more Iranian oil means more global supply. That generally pushes prices down.
How much of a drop are we talking?
The reports suggest anywhere from, say, 5% to maybe even 13%. That's a noticeable difference.
And that hits the Gulf producers hard, right?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait.
Exactly. Lower revenues, tougher competition for market share, especially in Asia. It could force them to speed up their own economic diversification plans. Might even lead to price tensions or, competition within OPEC plus.
What about countries that buy oil?
For them, it's generally good news. Lower energy costs help consumers and industries.
And Iran also has a lot of natural gas, doesn't it?
Huge reserves. If they can attract the investment to develop it for export, yeah, they could become a much bigger player. Potentially challenging Qatar in the LNG market, maybe competing with Russian gas going to Turkey or even Europe down the line.
So another layer of energy competition. And within OPEC plus Y, you mentioned strain.
Yeah, OPEC plus unity is always fragile. If Iran comes back aggressively trying to reclaim the market share it lost under sanctions, that could definitely cause friction within the group. How do they accommodate that extra supply?
Let's look at specific neighbors. The reports had some interesting details. What about Iraq? They already get energy from Iran.
For Iraq, it could mean more stable, maybe cheaper electricity and gas imports in the short term. That helps with their power shortages.
Right.
But the risk is it deepens their dependence on Iran. It might discourage Iraq from developing its own resources and raises, sovereignty questions.
Okay. Turkey, they have a big trade relationship already.
Turkey could definitely benefit.
Yeah.
Easier trade could help them hit that $30 billion target they talk about. It also solidifies Turkey's role as an energy hub. Lots of potential business.
Any downsides for Turkey?
Well, potentially more competition. Iran might compete more strongly in manufacturing or for regional infrastructure projects.
And the UAE, particularly Dubai, which has been a key hub for Iran.
Dubai's role could expand further, yeah. More trade, more finance flowing through. But the UAE also feels the pain of lower oil prices, like other Gulf states. And they might face competition from a resurgent Iran in areas like petrochemicals or real estate.
Plus maybe more scrutiny on money laundering.
That's a point raised, yes. As volumes increase, regulators globally might look more closely at financial flows to ensure compliance.
And the big one, Saudi Arabia. How does this affect the rivalry?
It's a direct challenge on the oil front, no question.
Wow.
Lower revenue, market share battles. It really tests that recent détente brokered by China. They'll also be competing for foreign investment in non-oil sectors. But if tensions genuinely ease long-term, maybe it opens doors for cooperation, too. It's a complex dynamic.
Really is. What about Afghanistan and Pakistan? The reports mention them, too.
For Afghanistan, access to Iran's Chabahar port becomes even more critical if sanctions ease. It gives them the route to the sea that doesn't rely on Pakistan. That's huge for a landlocked country.
Then Pakistan. The pipeline.
Right, the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. Sanctions relief might make it easier to finally complete, which Pakistan badly needs for energy. But there are still big financing and geopolitical obstacles to overcome there.
And the Central Asian countries, also mostly landlocked?
Iran becomes a much more attractive transit route for them, connecting them south to the sea and potentially westwards, too. It boosts initiatives like the North-South Transport Corridor.
But again, needs investment.
Big time. Infrastructure needs upgrading, and coordination between countries is key. And they might also find themselves competing with Iran on some trade routes.
Interesting. Okay, before we shift to the bigger geopolitical map, you mentioned this formalization effect. What's that about?
Right, so sanctions tend to push trade into the shadows, smuggling informal networks. Lifting sanctions should, in theory, make formal trade more attractive.
So less smuggling, more official customs and taxes.
That's the idea. Better revenue for governments, maybe more reliable economic data. But the flip side is, it could disrupt border communities that have come to depend on that informal trade. And those profiting from the shadow economy, they might resist the change.
Okay, got it. So the economic changes are massive, potentially. Let's talk geopolitics now. An economically stronger Iran, that's got to reshape the regional power map, right?
Absolutely. It fundamentally changes the calculus. More resources mean potentially more influence. But a huge question hanging over everything is, how does Iran use that influence?
Do they focus inward on the economy or outward on projecting power?
That's the dilemma. Do they prioritize economic integration and maybe ease regional tensions, like the Saudi deal hinted at? Or do they double down on the axis of resistance, supporting their regional allies and proxies?
It's not necessarily an either, is it?
Probably not entirely, but the balance could shift. There are long-standing security doctrines, support for groups like Hezbollah, that's deeply embedded. It won't just disappear. But maybe the emphasis changes.
What influences that choice?
Several things. The actual terms of any deal are their conditions tied to regional behavior. The internal power balance in Tehran, who's calling the shots, hardliners or more pragmatic factions, and how do rivals and global powers react? All that feeds into Iran's decisions.
So let's look at those relationships. Iran and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. What happens there?
Well, the diplomatic reopening with Saudi Arabia creates an opportunity for more dialogue, maybe more trade, even security talks. But the underlying mistrust, especially over the nuclear program and Iran's regional role, that's likely to persist.
And the Abraham Accords. Israel's deals with some Arab states.
Their relevance might shift. If the perceived threat from Iran diminishes because of a deal, maybe the strategic driver behind those accords becomes less urgent for some parties.
Okay. What about Iran and Turkey?
We'll likely see stronger economic ties, maybe more cooperation in some areas, but also, probably, continued competition for influence in places like Syria, Iraq, the Caucasus, their neighbors with complex overlapping interests.
And Iran, Israel. Any change there?
The reports are pretty clear. Probably not much change, unfortunately. The deep hostility is expected to remain. Israel will stay incredibly wary of Iran's capabilities and intentions, and the potential for conflict. Even unilateral Israeli action remains a serious risk.
Then there are the big powers.
Right.
The U.S., China, Russia. How do they fit in?
It's a complex triangle. Any U.S.-Iran engagement is likely to be cautious, phased, too much history, too much suspicion on both sides, plus U.S. domestic politics.
So maybe not a full reset.
Probably not a best friend scenario, no. More likely a narrow focus on the nuclear deal, maybe some partial sanctions relief, or perhaps a broader attempt at normalization, a grand bargain trying to tackle regional issues too, but that's ambitious.
And China and Russia. Sanctions pushed Iran closer to them.
They did. Relief gives Iran more options, maybe lets them diversify relationships a bit. But those strategic ties with Beijing and Moscow, forged partly out of necessity, are likely to remain important. China, especially, will continue building its economic and political influence across the region, possibly offering an alternative model to U.S.-led engagement.
So, different paths potentially opening up. What does all this mean for actual conflicts in the region and the overall security picture?
Well, if sanctions relief is genuinely tied to Iran moderating its regional behavior, and if that's verifiable, then you might see less intense conflicts. Maybe less direct support for proxies.
That's a big if.
It is. Because Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, various militias in Iraq and Syria, it's a core part of their security strategy. Dismantling that network isn't likely. But perhaps the nature of the support changes more political, less military. Hard to say.
And the nuclear proliferation risk.
That remains a huge concern. If a durable deal isn't reached and enforced, the fear is it could trigger a regional arms race. Other countries might feel they need their own nuclear deterrent.
So the security landscape might shift towards other kinds of threats?
Yeah, possibly more focus on asymmetric warfare, cyber attacks, non-state actors, which underlines the need for better regional security cooperation, intelligence sharing, things like that.
Okay, so these big external shifts must have internal echoes within Iran. What about the politics, the society?
Oh, definitely. Easing sanctions would likely intensify the internal debates. You got factions pushing for more engagement, arguing it brings economic benefits. They'd likely feel emboldened if the economy improves.
The reformists or pragmatists?
Right. But then you have the hardliners, elements within the security forces like the IRGC, who've built influence, even economic power, under the resistance economy model. They'll fight to keep that influence.
So a potential power struggle.
A sharpening of existing struggles, yes. And looming over it all is the supreme leader, who ultimately sets the strategic course and the eventual question of his succession. That adds another layer of uncertainty. The kind of deal pursued a narrow nuclear one or something broader involving China maybe reflects these internal calculations about Iran's future path.
And the younger generation.
They're generally more connected to the world, maybe more impatient for change. Economic improvement could empower them, but also raise expectations for social and political freedoms.
Which leads to the societal impact. Does economic relief translate into, say, better human rights?
That's the hope, but it's not guaranteed. You can see what they call a revolution of rising expectations, people wanting more freedoms, better governance once their basic economic needs are met. Civil society might push harder.
But the regime might push back.
Exactly. Economic improvement doesn't automatically mean political liberalization. The government might still crack down on dissent to maintain control.
Yeah.
And remember, Western countries might keep targeted sanctions in place specifically over human rights, even if nuclear sanctions are eased.
So how the regime handles those social demands will be a key test.
A very key test for stability, yes.
This has been incredibly thorough. So pulling it all together, the reports seem to paint a few possible futures, right? Different scenarios.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, you could imagine a few paths. One is sort of pragmatic re-engagement. Iran focuses more on the economy, domestic reform, maybe dials down the regional tensions somewhat.
Okay, what's another?
Another is maybe resource assertiveness. Iran uses the new money to double down on its regional influence, support proxies more, leading to more competition, more tension.
And a third?
Maybe something in between, like partial relief in enduring instability, where if sanctions are only partially lifted, growth is uneven, political infighting continues, and Iran's behavior on the world stage remains pretty inconsistent.
So it really underscores how easing sanctions isn't an endpoint, but maybe the start of a whole new chapter with massive interconnected consequences.
That's exactly it. Economic shifts, political realignments inside Iran, changing regional dynamics, the role of global powers, it's all tied together.
Huge opportunities, but also significant risks.
Definitely. It really depends on the choices made by Iran, by its neighbors, by the U.S., China, everyone involved.
So a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Looking at those scenarios, pragmatic re-engagement, resourced assertiveness, or that messy middle ground of instability, which one feels most plausible to you right now, what signs or indicators would you be watching for in the coming months or years? And how much influence do external powers, like the U.S. pursuing one kind of deal versus China, perhaps facilitating another, ultimately have in nudging the region down one path versus another? Lots to think about.
Indeed. The choices made now could set the direction for decades.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.